Thanks very much for coming this evening. And what I'd like to talk about are a couple subjects relating to history, and I hope you will find these subjects relatively interesting. I want to talk about how I got involved initially in this area, and then what I'd like to do is talk about something that commemorates an area, a time that we're now, in effect, marking. As we all know, it was last weekend that we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, one of the most devastating battles in our country's history, 51,000 casualties over 3 days of combat, and it really was the turning point of the Civil War. Had it gone differently, the Civil War probably would have gone differently. And so it's about 150 years from now, or 150 years ago, on November the 19th, that Abraham Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address, marking the tragedy and the tribulations associated with the Battle of Gettysburg. So what I'd like to do is to kind of talk a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, why it's such a famous address, why many people say it's the most famous address or speech ever given by an American, maybe by any public figure. Before I get to that, for those who were not here last year when I gave a talk, let me just give you a little bit of a sense of how I got involved in this. I am not a historian. I'm a business person, or some people would say not that good a business person. I'm a lawyer by training, but I really spend most of my time in the business world. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I was going to New York, and I saw in my mail that I was invited that evening to go to a viewing of the Magna Carta, a document that some people would say is among the most famous documents in the Western world, maybe the most important document in the Western world. And I decided to go to the viewing. It was at Sotheby's. I am not an art collector, so I'd never been to Sotheby's. I went in there. The curator described it to me. She said, this is one of the 17 copies of the Magna Carta. There are 15 in British institutions, one in the Australian Parliament. And this one was owned by Ross Perot, the only one in private hands. He had bought it in the early 1980s. He spirited it out of England somehow, put it on display at the National Archives, and he had a dispute with the National Archives since he decided to put it up for sale. The purpose of the proceeds was to use it for paying for medical treatment of Iraqi war veterans, obviously a very good cause. She said to me she thought that this document would leave the country because she knew who the likely bidders were, and she thought it would go to someplace in the Middle East or in Russia or someplace. And I don't know why, but just in the middle of that conversation, I decided I was going to come back the next night and buy it. Now, it's somewhat presumptuous to think you're going to buy the Magna Carta, so I didn't tell anybody, and I didn't want to mention it, so I just rearranged my schedule the next day, came back. I got there just before the auction was to occur, and I wanted to go down where you raise these paddles. I'd seen that on TV, and she said, no, for something like this, go in a little private room, and I didn't want to argue because I figured I'd missed the auction. She put me in a little private room, and then we started bidding, and if you've been in auctions, you know you get carried away with auctions, and so I got carried away, and I started bidding in the spirit of things, and then finally, nobody else was bidding, and so he said, sold. So the head of Sotheby's, who was the auctioneer that evening, came in and said, you just won, and you just bought the Magna Carta. Who are you? You've never been here before. I described who I was, and she said, or he said, well, okay, you can afford this, right? I said, yes. Well, as long as you can afford it, it's yours. We won't tell anybody who bought it. You can slip out. Nobody will know, or there are 100 reporters there who would like to know who bought the Magna Carta. And I decided that I would go out and talk to reporters because I wanted to say that what I wanted to do is to put it on a permanent, which means forever loan to the National Archives as a down payment on my obligation to repay what I owe to this country for coming from very modest circumstances and being able to afford that. And so I did that, and I got in the habit of doing similar things, typically with documents that symbolize freedom. In my own case, I came from very modest circumstances. Neither of my parents graduated from college or high school. My father worked in the post office, never made more than $7,500 a year. And for somebody whose last name is Rubenstein to be able to rise up to be able to afford something like this in a country like this, I thought was a great thing. I'm not sure I could have done that in other countries. And so the freedom that the Magna Carta and other documents symbolized for me and for people of my background just meant a lot to me. So I decided if other documents came along that symbolized freedom, I would buy some of them and put them on display as well. And so I have over the years done that. I've been offered other copies of the Magna Carta, I should add. many people call me all the time and say, would you like to buy my copy of the Magna Carta? I say to them typically, I don't want to corner the market on Magna Carta, so I won't buy yours. So I have bought 4 rare copies of the Declaration of Independence. One of them is there. That's called a stone copy. And a stone copy is a perfect replica. The original Declaration of Independence was being, I'd say, defaced a little bit and was being faded. So in 1832, or 1823, John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State then, decided to have a perfect copy made of the original Declaration. And he had 200 copies made, and it took 3 years. It was a wet cloth process put on the original. It took a lot of the ink off and ruined the original a little bit more. But 200 perfect copies were made. There are about 35 of them now left. One was given at that time to each of the living signers of the Declaration and each of the states and so forth. And today, when you see in the 4th of July, the New York Times, a printing of the Declaration of Independence, what you're actually seeing is a stone copy, the perfect replica. And I have put one of them in the State Department, one of them is the Archives, one of them is the National Constitution Center, and one of them is Mount Vernon. I've also bought 2 rare copies of the Emancipation Proclamation. The original of that Lincoln signed on January 1 of 1863 is in the archives. It's very fragile. It's only shown for a couple hours on January 1 of every year. But he signed 47 souvenir copies to be auctioned off to help pay for the medical treatment of soldiers. Only 6 of them sold for $10 a piece. There wasn't great demand for it. Now there are about 11 of them left, and I own 2 of them. One of them I've given to President Obama. It's in the Oval Office now. And one I will be giving to the African American History and Culture Museum, which is opening on the Mall, Smithsonian, in 2015. I recently bought a copy of the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment, which is, of course, the amendment that ended slavery, and that is Lincoln signed 5 of them, though, as many of you may know, if you watched the movie Lincoln and saw it, it was a terrific fight to get that amendment passed. Constitutional amendments aren't required to have presidents sign them. They have nothing to do with it, as the Senate reminded President Lincoln when they passed a resolution saying, you shouldn't be signing this 13th Amendment. You have nothing to do with constitutional amendments. He signed them nonetheless. There are about 5 or 6 of them left, and one of them that I bought I'll give to the African American History and Culture Museum as well. Most recently, I bought the first newspaper printing of the Declaration of Independence, and that was printed on July the 5th, 1776. And I bought a lot of these kind of documents, and to put them on display. My theory is that Americans know so little about history that if I can put them on display where the Americans can see them, it might be a good thing. Americans can learn more about history. A recent survey showed that Pew survey showed that more American high school students can name the first 3 names of the 3 Stooges than the first 3 names of any founding fathers, which is not a good thing. So there is a document there that I'm going to talk about in a minute that I don't own. It's the Gettysburg Address. There are 5 extant copies of the Gettysburg Address. No one really knows which one Lincoln really read from, but there are 5 of them, and they will probably never come for sale, but I suspect that if they did, they'd be worth between $50 and $75 million apiece. So let me talk about the Gettysburg Address for a moment. It's the most famous speech in American history, as I said, and maybe the most famous speech given by anybody. There are lots of surveys by experts on the best speeches, and typically Gettysburg Address comes in number 1 or number 2. Maybe number 1 competing with it is a series of speeches that Churchill gave in World War II, and other speeches that are considered to be great, and I'll just contrast the Gettysburg Address with those. As the 2 that you may know about, because many of you may have lived through them, is John Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961 and Martin Luther King's speech given almost 50 years ago next month on the March on Washington. So what makes a great speech? Well, let me just summarize at the beginning, and I'll go through the text of it a little bit later. But what makes a great speech? Well, a great speech is a speech that influences people. You know, if it's as they say, if a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? Well, if somebody gives a great speech, it's beautiful, it's well delivered, but nobody listens or nobody's influenced, it doesn't mean anything. So you need to have a speech that influences people. Gettysburg Address was not a speech that actually influenced that many people in the beginning. As I'll describe later, it wasn't that influential at the beginning. It later came to be symbolic of the best statement of what America is all about. And it became, really in the 20th century, not in the 19th century, a symbol of how one might describe what this country stands for. And again, it was only in 272 words, but Lincoln was a very, very skillful writer. And so a great speech really influences people. Martin Luther King's speech, I think, had some influence in the short term, probably more since he's been assassinated than actually when he was alive. because when he died, it became much more popular speech. John Kennedy's speech was influential from the time he gave it, and I think it still has influence. A great speech also is a speech that's given in a great setting. Inauguration, a funeral, or a cemetery consecration, or a march on Washington. You have to have a great setting. Typically, great speeches are given by people who are elected officials. Martin Luther King was not, and that's a rare exception. Generally, great speeches are given by elected officials. And typically, you also have great speeches being short. Martin Luther King's speech was, most of it was written in advance. He departed from it. The 10 minutes that he wrote, that was written out in advance, and then he added 5 minutes, the most famous parts, of course, in that part. So he ultimately spent about 15 minutes on his speech. John Kennedy spent 14 minutes on his. Lincoln spent about 3 minutes. If you give an hour-and-a-half speech, and I'm not going to give one, it's not generally going to be a great speech. What great speeches also have in common that they have an incredible use of language, and I would call it poetry in prose form. If you take a look at Lincoln's speech, it really is a very careful exercise in using a limited number of words, linking them in a way that is very memorable, and I'll go through that in a few moments. The same is true of John Kennedy's speech. I did work as a young man for Ted Sorensen, who helped President Kennedy write that speech, and if you go back and read that speech, it really is prose. It is really poetry in prose form. The same is true of Martin Luther King's speech. The first part that he wrote, and it was written and he read, was okay, not great, but what he did from memory was spectacular. And some of you may not know this, but when he gave his great speech, and it's going to be celebrated soon with the 50th anniversary march in August, everything that he gave, that he said, I have a dream, that was all from memory. He decided in the middle of the text to depart from the speech that he was given to read. He decided that he was really, in effect, doing so well that he wanted to give us, in effect, a sermon. And he had given this speech, I Have a Dream, before many times, and white people hadn't heard it, and they were mesmerized by it. President Kennedy, when he saw them afterwards, said, I have a dream, when he saw them, and he said, that's a hell of a great speech. It was a great speech, but it was off the top of his head, really, and it used a lot of memorable phrases that really made it such an important speech. Great speeches also have in common mnemonic devices or rhetorical devices, things that remind people and make people think about the speech. In Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, what he did is he used certain words repeatedly over and over again and linked them, and I'll describe when I go through the text of that. You can see every sentence links with another sentence. So he doesn't have a lot of big words. He doesn't have a lot of specifics. In fact, very few great speeches have specifics. In Lincoln's speech, there's no specifics. He doesn't mention Gettysburg, doesn't mention slavery, doesn't mention soldiers, doesn't mention anything specific. And the same is true of John Kennedy's speech. He didn't really mention any specific legislation he was going to pass or anything like that. The same is true of Martin Luther King's speech. These great speeches also use certain rhetorical devices that you're familiar with. One of them is called anaphora. Anaphora is repetition. I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. John Kennedy used a rhetorical device called antithesis. Ask not what your country can do for you, or never negotiate out of fear, never fear to negotiate. And those kind of antithesis kind of devices, in 23 sentences of the John Kennedy speech were antithesis, where they use these opposite kind of ways of expressing things. And in Lincoln's speech, he used several antitheses as well. World will little note nor long remember. He also used a device called a hooking, a device where he linked each sentence with the previous sentence by using the words that were in the previous sentence, and I'll go through in a moment. So great speeches also are ones which I think which seem to end in talking about God. Interestingly, if you go back and look at these speeches, they all seem to end with God. So Martin Luther King ended his speech, thank God Almighty. President Kennedy ended his speech by saying, with history the only sure measure of our success, we will ask God's blessing, in effect, to go when we go forward. And in the case of Lincoln, he ended his speech with the word God as well, as I'll describe in a few moments. So short, specific, not specific, referring to God, great setting, mnemonic devices that were kind of reused, rhetorical devices. These are things that make great speeches. But why wasn't Lincoln's speech considered so great at the beginning? And how did he come to deliver it? Well, let me go back and give you the background of it. And the background really starts in 1619. In 1619, the first slave ship came to the United States. It went to Jamestown, 20 slaves. Because they were baptized, they were treated as indentured servants. But they were the first slaves here. By the time those first slaves came here, there were already 1 million slaves in Latin America. And Latin America had many more slaves over history than we did in our country. Not that we should be bragging about it, but there were roughly 12 million slaves brought over from Africa, and probably about 800,000 were brought to the United States. We had, in the time of the Civil War, about 4 million slaves in the United States, but that was because of reproduction and other things. We imported about 800,000 slaves. More slaves were imported in Central America and Latin America because the medical treatment was worse there, and they died. The slaves tended to die more frequently, and there was just greater use because of greater agricultural needs there for slaves. But in the United States, the first slaves came in 1619. Gradually, they were used in agricultural purposes, but at the time of throughout the 1700s, slavery was very common in all the states. It wasn't banned anywhere. Even in the North, there were slaves, but slavery tended to be more common in agricultural areas. And by the time of the Declaration of Independence, the time of the Continental Congress, at that point, clearly there were more slaves in the South than there were in the North, but slavery was still reasonably prominent in some parts of the North. And in fact, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, about 40% of them were slave owners, some of them from the North, including Benjamin Franklin had been a slave owner. But gradually, as people went forward, it was recognized in the North that slavery was obviously not an ethical treatment of people. It was obviously immoral, and in many ways, people in the North thought it would die out. By the time of the Constitution was written, slavery was written into the Constitution without the word slavery being used. We had the famous Three-Fifths Compromise. Slaves were counted as 3/5 of humans, of a white person. And slavery was, at that point, very common in the South, in part because something happened in 1793. Slavery was mostly used in the South for tobacco farming and rice farming and indigo farming. And it wasn't really used that much for cotton farming, but then when the cotton gin was invented in 1793, it was a very effective way for cotton to be processed, and with large amounts of slaves, you could really consume enormous amounts of cotton and produce a lot of cotton, and cotton became the biggest export of the South. And as a result of cotton, slavery became more and more popular and used in the South, and more slaves were imported. But slavery was banned in terms of importation by 1808. Under the Constitution, 20 years after the Constitution was ratified, slave trade or slave importation was ended. But because of reproduction, there were still a lot more slaves, and illegal slaves were being brought into the country from time to time. And so what happened was slavery was kind of set forward. The North was not happy with it, but they weren't going to interrupt what was going on in the South. Northern states were beginning to get rid of slavery. Southern states were using it more and more. And typically, there was a détente that basically the South was being left alone. The North was not happy with it, but they weren't interfering with the South. And then what happened was, as new states came in, there was a fight. Should they be free? Should they have slavery? Should they not have slavery? And the fight was over several things, but one of them was a recognition that if more slave states became part of the United States, there would be more influence in Congress by the slave states. If fewer slave states became part of the Congress in the country, then ultimately it was feared in the South that slavery would be wiped out. And so after many battles back and forth, there was uncertainty, there was tension about whether new states being formed west of the Mississippi should be slave owners or should allow slavery or not. And then the famous Dred Scott decision, 1857, where the Supreme Court said, wait a second, United States, you can't tell states that they can't have slaves because slavery is permitted by the Constitution. The Fifth Amendment says you can't take property away, right? Well, slaves are property. So all slavery is to be permitted in any state. Well, that decision so upset people in the North that the effort to get rid of slavery increased. And then we're moving forward to the 1860 election. The political parties splintered over slavery, and a man who was not that well known, who had lost 2 Senate elections, Abraham Lincoln, became the Republican nominee. Republican Party had been formed more or less to combat slavery, but it wasn't an abolitionist party, but it was more or less to be more combative towards slavery and its expansion than the other parties. Lincoln got the nomination in part because he was from Chicago, he was from Illinois, the convention was in Chicago, that was very helpful. The 2 major competitors to him, William Seward and Salmon Chase, fought each other, and they were too well known. They kind of fought each other, and they kind of knocked each other out, in effect, and Lincoln became the nominee. When he became the nominee, in those days, people didn't campaign. so nobody really knew what his positions were, but it was believed by people in the South that he would not only prevent slavery from going into other new states, but eventually he would end slavery in the South. And because of that, even before he took office in March of 1861, South Carolina seceded, then six other states seceded, and ultimately 11 states seceded. And Lincoln became president, sworn in, he came to a train because it was rumored that he would be assassinated. He kind of slipped into Washington through the dead of the night, using some camouflage a bit. He becomes president, and he decides to fight the secession. Some members of his cabinet said, let him go. Let the southern states go. Who cares? We don't really need them. There was a fight at that time about whether we should even try to combat the southern states leaving. Lincoln said, no, I really want this country to hold together, and I'm fighting for the unification of the country to hold it together. I don't really care about slavery as much as I care about holding the country together. And so he decided to gain troops. It took a while for the North to get ready to fight. The South really was outmanned in many ways. There were 22 million people in the North, only 9 million people in the South, and of those 9 people in the South, about 4 million of them were slaves. So about 5 million people in the South, white people who were eligible theoretically to fight, and obviously some of them were women. They weren't going to be fighting. So they had a much smaller number of troops. During the entire Civil War, about 750,000 people were killed. More people were killed in the Civil War than all the other wars the United States has fought combined. In the Revolutionary War, we lost about 6,000 people. We lost 750,000 people in the Civil War. And think about this, about 21% of all young adult males were killed in the Civil War, 21%. 3.6% of the entire population was killed. So today, 3.6% of our 310 million people will be roughly 10.5 million people. So today, it's as if 10.5 million people were killed. That's how devastating, how large the casualties were. When the war first started, though, because of the greater size of the North, the greater railroad capacity, the greater industrialization, there were 100,000 factories in the North. There were only 20,000 factories in the South. There were only 9,000 miles of train track in the South, and they often didn't connect with each other very well. The North thought it would win very well and very handily. In fact, the first battle of Bull Run in Northern Virginia, a lot of congressmen and other citizens from Washington and Maryland came down to kind of watch as a spectator sport. The North crushed the South and then go on to Richmond and end the war in a couple weeks. Have any of you ever heard of a war that was supposed to start in a couple weeks and be over in a couple weeks? And you ever heard of that? So it was a similar situation. But what happened is it turned out that the South had much better generals, led by Robert E. Lee. The North had a series of generals who weren't all that wonderful, and President Lincoln kept replacing them. And it really was going on for quite some time and really wasn't making a lot of progress. And so at one point, as a way to end the war, President Lincoln issued on January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was really designed to weaken the Southern war base because the slaves were doing a lot to help the Southern war base. They were doing a lot of the work while the Southern whites were doing the fighting. And without the slaves doing a lot of the work, it was thought that the South war machine would fall apart. It was very controversial to do that. Lincoln's cabinet was against it. They asked him to put it off for a time, and he did put it off until January 1 of 1863. And many of the people in the North were upset about it because they said, we fought this war and we're fighting this war, and soldiers said, we're fighting this war to keep the Union together, not to free the slaves. We have no interest in freeing the slaves. And the truth is, a lot of abolitionists in the North, they were concerned about it too, because they were concerned that while freeing slaves is one thing, but they might be coming to the North and taking our jobs. And it was a very controversial thing. In fact, Lincoln, while known as the great emancipator, he had been, as a young man, a man who made a lot of racial jokes. He was not thought to be a person who really believed in equality in the sense that people should live together. In fact, while he did believe, as I'll go through in the address, he did believe that people were born equal. He didn't really think they could live together equally. In fact, his program all along in his life, even when he was president, even after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, was to have slaves leave the country. It was then used, a euphemism was called colonization. Lincoln's view had always been that you compensate slave owners, and in fact, even after the Emancipation Proclamation and before the 13th Amendment, Lincoln was in favor of spending $400 million to compensate the slave owners. So Lincoln always believed in compensation. He always believed that the slaves should leave the country, and the first time that black people had gone to the White House was under an invitation from President Lincoln where he came to them and talked to them about leaving the country. And he had plans to have them go to Central America or go back to Africa. This was always his plan. His view was that blacks and white could not live together. So when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, there were many people who had similar views to his. It was very unpopular, but it didn't actually have the desired effect. Maybe 20,000 slaves were freed, but it didn't have the desired effect because while he used the military powers he thought he had as President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, to free the slaves, if you were a slave owner, you didn't listen to Lincoln. You weren't going to say, well, Lincoln just said that you're free, you should go. It didn't happen. Now, some slaves heard about it, they left, and about 200,000 slaves who were freed ultimately fought for the North in the war, and it was very helpful, but it didn't actually end slavery. And think about it. In January 1 of 1863 is when it was issued, but the war didn't end until April of 1865. So as the war was moving forward and more and more progress was made, ultimately Lincoln became convinced that he would have to issue he would support the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment, if all of you have seen the movie Lincoln, was passed shortly before he died. And let me just skip forward to that a moment. Anybody not seen the movie Lincoln? Okay. And the movie Lincoln, it's a historical drama, pretty accurate. They had a lot of very good scholars working on it. And for those who aren't familiar with the movie, Doris Kearns Goodwin had told Steven Spielberg, I want to do a book on Lincoln. And Lincoln had, and Spielberg, when he was 5 years old, had visited the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. And he always looked up at this big Lincoln and he said, wow, I'm afraid of this man when he first saw him. And then he came closer to him and he saw it was a friendly face and he really liked Lincoln. He always wanted to make a movie about Lincoln. He was always impressed with Lincoln. When Doris Kearns Goodwin said, I'm going to write a book about it in 1999, he said, I want to make the movie. She took her 10 years to write the movie, to write the book. In 2009, he finally got ready to move forward with the book. The book is 800 pages. He had a scriptwriter and another scriptwriter, and ultimately he had Tony Kushner write a different script that really only dealt with 4 pages of the book, and that was the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And if some of you who've seen the movie may remember, it was, ironically, the movie was filmed in the state capital of Virginia, which was the head of the Confederacy. But for the purposes of this movie, it was seen as being the Congress. But ironically, it was the Virginia state capital that was actually the capital in that movie. It was true. Lincoln wanted the 13th Amendment passed because the Emancipation Proclamation only said slaves who are subject to, who have pulled away from who are in southern states, and under my commander-in-chief powers, I basically am saying that the southern states don't have the right to own slaves, and I'm going to free them. But once the war was over, those war powers couldn't be used, so Lincoln was very concerned about what happened with the freed slaves. He felt that an amendment to the Constitution was necessary. He initially wasn't as interested in it, but he did help get it through, and as some of you may remember from the movie, even though he won re-election in 1864, he won it in November, and he would take office again, and the new Congress would take office in March of 1865. He didn't want to wait till March of 1865. He would control both houses of Congress, could easily get the 13th Amendment through, but he decided to get it through quicker because he felt that it would help end the war, because once it was clear that he wasn't the person supporting emancipation only, it was all the states supporting it, it would ultimately end the war. It may have worked a bit, and the war actually ended before the ratification occurred. The ratification didn't occur until December of 1865. Lincoln, of course, was killed in April. But before the ratification and after the emancipation became the most important battle of the war, Gettysburg. And here's what happened in Gettysburg. The South was doing really relatively well, although they had fewer troops by far. They had a total, in the entire war, they had about 800,000 troops. The North had about 1.5 million troops. So they had fewer troops, but they had very clever generals. And in 1863, 2 very significant battles were lost by the North when they had twice as many troops. One of them was the Battle of Chancellorsville, and one of them was the Battle of Fredericksburg. But Lee realized that even though he won those wars, those battles, he didn't have a lot of munitions. He didn't have a lot of food for his troops. He didn't have a lot of shoes. About one third of his soldiers didn't have shoes. He needed to do something to bring the end, because he thought in the end the overwhelming strength of the North would eventually wear down the South. So he decided to try to do something that was maybe a very clever move. He decided to go into the North and see if he could win something in the North. He had tried that once before at Antietam and more or less had to withdraw. But he decided to move his troops, about 75,000 to 80,000 troops, into the North, into Pennsylvania. And it wasn't quite clear where it would be, but he thought if he got into the North, he won a battle in the North, the The election might change because in 1863, the 1864 election hadn't occurred yet. He thought if I could win something in the North, that the North would give up maybe fighting, we can get a better deal, we can compromise, we can get a deal done where slavery will still be permitted and we can remain separate. And so that was the strategy. He looked around various places in Virginia, in Pennsylvania. Gettysburg was a central place in southeast Pennsylvania. It wasn't necessarily the place he decided to hold the battle, but as his troops were moving forward, they kind of encountered the North there, and on July 1st of 1863, the battle began. And the Southern troops and the Northern troops fought. The Southern troops made some progress, and they gained some high ground, and then on July the 2nd, the South gained a little bit more high ground, but the North decided to hold on a ridge, and they fought back, and they held their ground. And so basically you have about 90,000 Northern troops beginning and about 75,000 Southern troops, and they're at I'd say a standoff, but the South is doing reasonably well. And at one point, the new general, General Meade, who was then the new general for the North, wasn't sure whether he should retreat or hold, and hold firm for the next day. He decided to hold firm. The next day, on July the 3rd, the battle was moving forward, and at one point, late in the afternoon, General Lee says, okay, to General Pickett, I authorize you to go forward and charge up what was called the Cemetery Ridge, a kind of embankment. And during the entire war, virtually nobody who was a higher point lost to somebody from a lower point. And so it was decided that General Pickett would send his troops up this ridge and try to do what he could. So we had 12,500 troops moved up, and 7,000 of them were killed in the process. So he viewed later Lee as having slaughtered his troops because they went into a sure death. And when that happened, and when Pickett's remaining troops came back, Lee realized he'd lost a lot of troops. He had suffered more damage than he thought he could tolerate. He decided on the night of the 3rd to basically escape and go back to the South. And Meade was importuned by some of his subordinate generals to go after Lincoln and to go after Lee and end the war right there. Capture Lee and keep them from going back to the South. He didn't do it. He chose to wait a while. He went another day or two before he went after Lee. Lee escaped. He got back into the South, and the war went on for another year and a half. But had Lee won that battle, the war probably would have been over because the desire in the North to keep fighting would have been gone. And it's a very interesting thing. You might say, why is it in the Gettysburg battle, there were so many people killed? There were 51,000 casualties. 51,000 people were killed or injured or mutilated in that battle. Why were there so many? And why so many in the whole Civil War? Why were there 750,000 people killed? Well, this is the reason. In the Napoleonic era, the concept was that you move troops forward in great lines, and you move forward and you overwhelm the other side. But while that was the concept that Napoleon had used and had been used in the Revolutionary War and other wars, since the time that concept had taken hold, munitions had improved, the artillery had improved, and so you had, in effect, machine guns, you had ability to shoot people much more readily than before, and as a result, you could shoot people and kill them pretty readily, much more than you could before, and so if somebody's charging up a hill, you have the ability to shoot them pretty readily, and as a result of that, you had really 17th century military tactics been used against, in effect, late 19th century military weapons. And of course, if you got injured during the war and you had to be treated, the chances of your dying because of medical problems or because of disease was pretty high. And so a lot of people who were injured never actually survived the injury. And so that's why there were so many injuries in the war and so much death in the war. What happened after Lee retreated was that 7,000 bodies are on the battlefield of Gettysburg. 3,500 horses are there. And the waste products of 100,000 soldiers are also on the battlefield. So the stench from the soldiers, from everything else, was unbelievable. For days and days, miles around, everybody could smell this terrible death. And the heat was coming down, and it was just unbelievable. You could burn the horses, and they did, but if a horse was near a house, you were afraid of burning down the house, so they didn't burn everything. When soldiers died in the Civil War, it was very important. Death was very important at that time. It's always very important, but it was very important to make sure you knew who died. They were given a proper burial. But in this time, it was much more complicated because people didn't know who was really killed. The Northerners didn't want to take care of the Southerners. And so what they tended to do is that the Southerners would tend to, when they were retreating, they didn't take their dead with them. In fact, they left some doctors behind to treat those injured, but they retreated. The Northerners were left with all these bodies. The Northerners didn't really want to help the Southern bodies. Ultimately, they covered them, a lot of them up. Thousands of them were covered up in very shallow graves. And sometimes when the rain would come, people's body parts would stick up. And it was an awful situation. The smell was terrible. The governor of Pennsylvania, Governor Curtin, said, we've got to do something about this. And he asked a young man who was a lawyer, businessman in Gettysburg, to see if we could get a cemetery to appropriately bury these people, but only the ones from the north, not the ones from the south. And ultimately, David Wills, who was this lawyer, bought for about $2,000 or $3,000 17 acres. He hired a man who had designed a very famous cemetery, Mount Auburn in Massachusetts, to come down and design a cemetery. And they decided to have a burial procedure, and they decided what they would do when they inaugurated this cemetery was to have the greatest speaker in the land come. Was it Abraham Lincoln? No. It was a man named Edward Everett. Edward Everett was a former congressman, a former senator, a former governor of Massachusetts, a former president of Harvard, by far the greatest speaker of the day. He was a person who wrote out long speeches, and typically about historical subjects, and memorized them, and then gave them without any notes, though he would send out the text in advance. And he was asked if he would come and speak. And he had spoken at the dedications of similar things, the Battle of Concord, Lexington, and Bunker Hill. And he said he would, but he needed time to prepare. Nobody really known what had happened yet at Gettysburg. So he was asked to speak. He was invited in September 23rd, I think. He was asked to speak on October 23rd. He said, no, I can't do it before November 19th. One of the other reasons was he was ill, and he didn't want to tell people that. He had some illnesses, but he agreed to speak on November 19th, so it was set. November 19th, they would dedicate this cemetery. A couple weeks later, it was thought that maybe it'd be a good idea to invite President Lincoln. Now, some of you may say, well, why wouldn't they have invited him first? Well, Everett was the great speaker. Lincoln had actually not made a public speech since his inauguration. He was not a big public speaker. He wasn't known as a great orator. Many people made fun of his looks. Many people made fun of his style. He wasn't all that popular, frankly, and he wasn't known as a great orator. In those days, there wasn't television. There weren't really movies, and so if you wanted to be entertained, you would listen to a great speaker for 2 hours. Remember, the Lincoln-Douglas debates went on for hours and hours, and people stood there. And this was what Everett was good at. And he made a lot of famous speeches about George Washington at battle, so he was invited as the key speaker. Ultimately, just a few weeks before the dedication, Lincoln was invited. Lincoln immediately accepted. A train was prepared. He was going to go up that morning and come back, but he said, no, traffic isn't so easy. I might miss it. If I go in the morning, I'll go the night before. He went the night before. He stayed at David Will's house. He went out to the cemetery that morning to inspect it, to take a look at it. They went up the next day, or they went up later in the day. He rode up on his horse, got off. There were a lot of ceremonies there after the bands played. Everett got up and gave a 2-hour beautiful speech about the history of the war and what it was all about. And for many people, they had known about the war before, because they had known about the battle, they'd known the details. There were about 15,000 people there. There were no megaphones or anything, so he had to project very loud. And then after he gave his speech, and it was a lot of applause for it, Lincoln was invited to go up to speak. Lincoln had a text that he prepared. It was often rumored, this was not true, that he'd written on the back of an envelope on the way up. That wasn't true. Lincoln was a very, very skillful writer. Although he'd never gone to school, he'd read enormous amounts. He loved reading out loud Shakespeare. He knew the Bible inside out. He was a very good writer, but a very slow writer. He wrote very carefully. He didn't use big words, but he wrote with great precision. And it's often said that great prose writers are terrible poets. Well, Lincoln began as a terrible poet. He wrote poetry as a young man, wasn't wonderful, but he learned how to use words very carefully. And so Lincoln actually wrote the speech out the night before, part of it, the day or two before he went there. He wrote out the first page. When he got there the night before, he hadn't finished it. That morning, he asked for a piece of paper. He wrote out the second page of it, and he wrote out the speech. The speech was 272 words. That's it. And in that 272 words, at the time that he got up to give the speech, after he sat down, somebody sitting next to him said, "Is that all?" And he said, "Well, that's all for now." And that's all he had. And he thought, it's rumored that he said to somebody sitting next to him, that speech didn't scour, that speech didn't work. And the truth is, many people didn't think it was so wonderful, but the thing that was most upsetting to people who heard the speech was that he tried to change, in the view of some people, what the country was all about. And I'll go through that in the text in a moment. He tried to change what the country was all about. But it was not for many years until later, later that the speech became famous. It wasn't really to the 20th century when the war was over, when the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't so important, because Lincoln always said, I will be remembered for the Emancipation Proclamation. He never said, I'll be remembered for the Gettysburg Address. That was never in the offing. And then after in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Emancipation Proclamation became less significant. And then when we went to World War I and World War II, people really wanted a statement about what the country was about. When the Lincoln Memorial was built, it had on it the full text of the Gettysburg Address, along as the part of the second inaugural address. And gradually, school students began to memorize it. People around the world began to see it as a perfect statement about what democracy was about. And if you have in front of you the text, some of you may have the text in front of you. I'll just go through it for a moment before I finish. Let me tell you what this really means. And you take the part that doesn't have the underlining on it. 77 years ago. Why didn't he say 87 years? Well, Lincoln was using a biblical reference. In Psalms 90, there's a reference to 10 years. So it's a biblical way of saying things. And by talking in biblical terms, you are really, in effect, giving a sermon. And I think it certainly had religious overtones, and I think that's why Lincoln used it. So 7 years ago, our fathers. It's a reverential way to talk about the forefathers. Brought forth. Brought forth is a biblical reference. Jesus was brought forth by Mary. The Jews were brought forth from Egypt in the Old Testament. Brought forth kind of conveys birth, but it's a biblical phrase. Brought forth on this continent a new nation. He didn't say a confederation of states, a nation. So he's making it clear it's a nation, not a bunch of states. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition. The proposition is a Euclidean word dealing with geometry. He was skilled in geometry. He'd studied Euclid, and he always loved that word, that all men are created equal. And that's the key to the entire sentence and the whole entire speech. And let me describe what I mean here. The most famous sentence in the English language, the most famous sentence, is probably the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Although Jefferson wrote that, well, he had 2 slaves and he owned 60 slaves, and later had several children by one of his slaves. Jefferson was not in favor of slavery, but he didn't think he could get rid of it, and he basically gave up trying to get rid of slavery. But Jefferson believed that people were at least born equal. They may not be able to live together equally, and he also believed in something like colonization. Many people thought that that was a nice statement, but irrelevant. The Constitution basically said slavery is part of the country. The Declaration of Independence was a propaganda document. There was one person who actually believed that the Declaration of Independence was the relevant document. That man was Abraham Lincoln. He always believed that Jefferson was the greatest American. And so when he makes this reference 7 years ago, he's not talking about the beginning of the Constitution, he's talking about the day the Declaration of Independence was written. And he said that's when the country began, when the Declaration of Independence was written, and that's what he's saying, that all men are created equal. He's in effect making the same reference. He's in effect saying all men are created equal. And the reason that's so controversial is that people who were fighting the war, as I mentioned earlier, didn't say, we're fighting to make sure that slaves are freed, we're fighting to make sure everybody's equal. They weren't fighting for that. Most of the people in the North were fighting for one thing, which is to keep the Union together. Okay, so that's a key sentence. And really, and Gary Wills, who wrote a book about the Declaration, about the Gettysburg Address, says by that one sentence, in effect, Lincoln reinvented America. Because what he really said was that America was really about everybody being equal, when in fact that had never been what the Constitution was about, and it really hadn't been part of the law. It was Jefferson and Lincoln communing together that everybody was equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives, that that nation might live. What he's really saying is that we are here to remind everybody that it's important to keep the Union together, and this great concept of holding the Union together and making sure everybody is treated equal in this Union is what I'm all about. Is altogether fitting and proper that we should do so, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. Dedicate, consecrate, hallow, all biblical phrases. This ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. So he's in effect saying, we are here normally to open this cemetery, consecrate it, but we really can't. It's the people who died here. They really consecrated it. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Not false modesty, but it was Lincoln's way of saying that what's really important is what the people who did, what the soldiers did here, not what we say. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Died in vain was a phrase that George Washington often used when he visited troops that had been killed, and it was well known that that was a Washington phrase, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth, new birth. Remember, we're talking about birth, brought forth, we're talking about people dying, and now we're talking about rebirth. It's very biblical. Birth, death, rebirth. A new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. That very famous sentence, government of the people, by the people, for the people, may have been taken from some other people. Daniel Webster used a phrase like that. Abraham Lincoln's law partner said that he'd given language like that once before to Lincoln. Lincoln didn't claim that he was writing original things. If you turn to the next page, you'll see some of the mnemonic devices. Turn it over. What Lincoln did is he used words repeatedly. So you'll see, I've underlined here, the word nation is repeatedly used. Dedicated. Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And in the next sentence, he hooks it by saying, now we engage in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, repeating the word nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. By hooking these phrases, these sentences together, it kind of brings together in a very compact way. He repeats these words over and over again. And you'll see I've underlined dedicate is used throughout here, consecrated, dedicated, devotion. These words that he used over and over again kind of have as a mnemonic device to link together the concept that he's trying to give to people. And ultimately, though, what he really was trying to do was to say that the purpose of the war, the purpose of this war, was to hold the Union together because we were engaged in a great experiment to see whether this Union, when a country where everybody's created equal, is one which can long endure. And that didn't sink in for a while, but eventually, and now, people recognize that there probably are no other 272 words that better describe what the country is all about. And actually, after he was finished the speech, and he didn't think very well of it, later he got a letter from Edward Everett saying that I said in 2.5 hours what you said in 2 minutes, much better. And that's probably true. So Lincoln, when he went back after giving the speech, he was not happy with the reaction to it because he didn't get a great standing ovation or anything. He did get there were 5 interruptions for applause. He went back and he actually gave this speech probably when he was sick. He probably had smallpox at the time. He wasn't feeling very well. And afterwards, it wasn't mentioned that much, but those people who mentioned the speech kind of criticized it for kind of reinventing the country and saying we're really fighting for equality when that really wasn't what it was all about. But as I say, after he died and many years later, probably in the 20th century, it came to be seen as the great statement of what the country is all about. So let me end there by saying that if any of you want to give a great speech sometime, just take a look at this and you'll see the way that words are used very carefully, very judiciously. He repeats these words, and he uses many mnemonic devices that I think really help make this speech probably the best single statement about what the country is all about. Thank you very much. So, thank you. Right, thank you. I think I have about 15 minutes of questions, if there are any questions. If not, you can leave. But anybody, any questions about Lincoln, Gettysburg, the Civil War? I should have pointed out, maybe you all know, Nantucket had, 73 soldiers die in the Civil War. I don't know if any were Gettysburg, but 73 soldiers. No? Okay, yes, sir.
After this riveting and mesmerizing last hour, I think Mr. Collins,
This, the private equity pays a little bit better than speeches, but when they have a carried interest in making speeches, I'll consider it, but there's no carried interest there. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I think it's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Right. Okay. Well, in my own case, you know, I'm one of the 40 people who originally signed the Giving Pledge, and I intend to give away the bulk of my money. I think, so I like to say, my children probably don't like to hear this, nobody ever won a Nobel Prize if they inherited lots of money. You know, people who do great things in life probably aren't people that inherited $100 million or $200 million, and I'm not sure my children would be better off. So I intend to give away a lot of my money, and I, as the new chairman of the board at Duke and other universities I'm involved with, I give most of my money to education and medical research. So pancreatic cancer, ALS, a whole variety of other things I'm involved with in universities. But I do give away a fair amount of money to things related to the United States. I think I benefited from being a citizen here, and so I try to help things in the United States that need money. So recently I gave some money to repair the Washington Monument, and some of you may know it's coming back eventually. I climbed it recently. I was going to go up the outside elevator. We have scaffolding there, and the Secretary of Interior showed up. She's a mountain climber, and she told me she had climbed Mount Rainier 7 times. And I said, well, I've flown over it 7 times, and I don't know if I can. She said, no, let's not take the elevator, let's climb up. So I climbed up. I didn't have a defibrillator. I thought I needed one or something, but we climbed up, we got to the point, and you know, you're 555 feet above. You know, you can see all of Washington's spectacular. So I've tried to do things that I give back to the country, the Kennedy Center, the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives, Smithsonian, things that where our country doesn't have the money as much anymore to do certain things. So I think citizens can do it. But I also think that I'm involved with a lot of educational institutions. I'm on several university boards and so forth. And my view is that while K-12 education in the United States is a bit of a disgrace, unfortunately, our higher education system is the envy of the world, and we should do the most we can to make this system even better, because if our graduates of our best universities stay in this country and they do great things for us, or even if they go elsewhere, it's going to be good for our country. So I really think education is the thing that enabled me to get from very modest circumstances, and I really spend a lot of my time trying to make educational institutions better. My concern is that today, in the K-12, it's so bad that we are really becoming a country of two different types of countries, 2 different types of people. In the city I live in, Washington, D.C., less than 50% of the people who enter high school, and public high schools, graduate from high school. And the numbers around the rest of the country are probably in public high school, somewhere between 60% of the people who enter graduate, but 40% don't. And the reason we have such growing income disparity is because people who don't graduate from high school tend to make much lower incomes. They tend to go to, into the prison system much more readily. It's a tragic situation. So I think you can't do much more than improve the education system for our country than you know, everybody should try to improve the education system if they can. K-12 needs a lot of help. I'm not sure anybody here has enough resources to tackle that, but in any one area, if you can make a difference, it's really important. In terms of the university system, again, we are the envy of the world. We have the best system, but it could fall apart if we don't remain vigilant. So this is the stone copy of the Declaration of Independence, one with all the signatures, and this is the one from really 1823, but it's the one that you typically see in the New York Times. And the reason it was, I should say, it wasn't really signed on July the 4th. It was on July the 2nd. You may remember that July the 2nd was the day that we decided to become independent from Britain. John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail, saying that this will be the greatest day in our country's history, and we'll celebrate this for hundreds of years with fireworks. Why do we celebrate July the 4th? Well, on July the 3rd and July the 4th, they agreed to the text of this document. It wasn't signed until August because they had to get it engraved and so forth, engrossed, and one of the states wasn't ready to approve it early, New York, so they came back on August the 4th and signed it really around August the 4th. The reason we celebrate the 4th and not the 2nd is this. On July the 2nd, 1777, they were in the Continental Congress's meeting, and they forgot to celebrate. They realized at the end of the day, they said, oh, we forgot we're supposed to celebrate. Well, let's do it, let's take a day or 2 to celebrate. Well, they did it on the 4th. And that became a source of dispute between Adams and Jefferson the rest of their lives, because Adams thought the thing he was responsible for was the voting to be independent on July the 2nd. Jefferson just wrote this document, which wasn't that significant in Adams' view, but he was always frustrated that Jefferson got all the glory because we celebrate July the 4th. And of course, as all of you know, they died within hours of each other on July the 4th, 50 years after this was signed. This is the Magna Carta. This one is the 1215 Magna Carta that all of you have heard about. That's irrelevant because it was, while it's famous, and we'll soon celebrate the 800th anniversary of it, in 1215, when King John put his seal to it, it he abrogated it within a couple weeks because he was told he'd be excommunicated for agreeing to it. Ultimately, the one that became the law is this one agreed to by King Edward. It's in 1297. Interestingly, in the 1215 version, there are 4 paragraphs that say, if you owe money to somebody that's Jewish, don't have to pay them. Because the Jews were the money lenders, and the barons were figuring, hey, if we're getting some things from the king, why don't we get the right to not have to pay back the Jewish money lenders? In the 1297 version, that's not there. So I thought maybe they liked Jews better in 1297 than 1215. It turns out in 1270, they kicked all the Jews out of England, so there were no Jews to worry about in 1297. And this is the Emancipation Proclamation. Interestingly, while the Gettysburg Address is poetry in prose form, Lincoln wrote this as a lawyer because he was afraid that the Dred Scott Court, or Roger Taney, would overrule the Emancipation Proclamation. So he wrote it very legalistically, didn't give any reasons, and it reads, as somebody has famously said, it's like a bill of lading, but this is actually it. And Lincoln, when he signed something that was significant, he wrote Abraham Lincoln. Generally, he always signed A. Lincoln, but on this and the 13th Amendment, he signed Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much.